As Jim said, I'm the chair of the conference planning group, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank key people who helped organize the conference. Michael Shropshire, Anna Stevens, Michelle Moss, and Barbara Paschke, and without these individuals, we just couldn't have pulled this off. And I'd also like to thank all of our volunteers, our summer students who are working hard at helping people to get registered. I would like to introduce Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Bravehart. She has been referred as the mother of historical trauma. Her theories of historical trauma and historical unresolved grief theory and interventions with American Indians has been extremely influential and is the basis of our conference today. In 1992, Dr. Bravehart founded the Takini Network, a Native nonprofit organization devoted to community healing from intergenerational massive group trauma among Native peoples. Dr. Bravehart's historical trauma and unresolved grief intervention is recognized as an exemplar model for the Center of Mental Health Services. Since 1976, she has worked not only with the Lakota in South Dakota, but also with tribes in New Mexico and the urban Indian population in Denver, as well as Latinos in New Mexico and New York. Dr. Bravehart has conducted historical trauma training for numerous tribes across the country and in Canada. Dr. Bravehart is currently Associate Professor in the School of Social Work and at Columbia University, and is a member of the Hispanic Treatment Program Research Team at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Please welcome Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Bravehart.
I address you as my relatives, and it's really, really good to be here. And I think it's interesting that, I'm Honkapapa no Glala Lakota. I don't remember if the introduction, so I sort of block those things out because it's kind of hard to hear things about yourself. But so I moved to New York City. I'm still in shock. I'm still living out of boxes too. About a year and a half ago to Columbia University from Denver, and I was in Denver and South Dakota, so for years. So this is a new experience for me. But so I gave up a mountain view for a river view. So I am blessed. I am blessed because I'm in faculty housing, and even though it's small and I'm still living out of boxes, I have a view of the river and it faces west, which for the Lakota, we start our prayers in the west, first facing west, and I get to see beautiful sunsets, and the water on the river is actually blue most of the time. And I'm shocked at that, so I was just amazed. And then there's Riverside Park there, so I get to hear the birds and I see trees, and that has kept my sanity. You know, it's been very important to be able to see that view constantly, so that just calms me down immediately when I see that. So some of my colleagues, unfortunately, have views of another building. They look into somebody else's kitchen window and it's dark, you know. So that would be very hard, I think. So I feel very fortunate, very blessed. I think it's interesting that during the prayer, this slide somehow came up. I don't know if somebody accidentally touched the key. This is the first slide, but I felt like it was important and significant and perfectly appropriate because this is about our ancestors and about the origin, really, of the historical trauma work and why it's so important. So as a way of introducing this, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And this is from a booklet that was prepared for the Sitting Bull and Bigfoot Memorial Ride in 1990. And it eloquently describes what we're talking about when we talk about historical trauma. And it says, it is our way to mourn for 1 year when one of our relations enters the spirit world. Tradition is to wear black while mourning our lost one. Tradition is to not be happy, not to sing and dance and enjoy life's beauty during mourning time. Tradition is to suffer with the remembering of our lost one and to give away much of what we own and to cut our hair short. But Chief Sitting Bull was more than a relation. He represented an entire people, our freedom, our way of life, all that we were. And for 100 years, we as a people have mourned our great leader. We have followed tradition in our mourning. We have not been happy, have not enjoyed life's beauty, have not danced or sung as a proud nation. We have suffered remembering our great chief and have given away much of what was ours. And blackness has been around us for 100 years. During this time, the heartbeat of our people has been weak and our lifestyle has deteriorated to a devastating degree. Our people now suffer from the highest rates of unemployment, poverty, and alcoholism and suicide in the country. So this was prepared by a traditional Hunkpapa Elders Council and really describes historical trauma. And just as a side note, which is important to come back to, something that a lot of people don't realize is that one of Sitting Bull's visions was to unite all indigenous peoples, and he made peace with traditional enemies in that process. So I feel like that's another piece of this work that's evolving. This other quote I want to share also kind of frames the concept, and this is from a Lakota parent in recovery that we have permission to use this quote. And he says, "I never bonded with any parental figures in my home. At 7 years old, I could be gone for days at a time and no one would look for me. I've never been to a boarding school. All of the abuse we've talked about happened in my home. If it had happened by strangers, it wouldn't have been so bad, the sexual abuse, the neglect. Then I could blame it all on another race." And then he added that his parents were boarding school survivors, and that's where they learned all this abuse because they were abused in boarding school, and then they passed that on. So the generational transmission of the trauma. And then a third slide as a way of introduction is the kinds of multiple losses and trauma exposure that our peoples experience. Such things as this is just with one situation. The death of 5 family members killed in a collision by a drunk driver on a reservation road. So the death of 5 at once. 1 month earlier, the death of a diabetic relative. The following month, adolescent cousin suicide and the death of another relative from a heart attack. And the surviving family members include individuals who are descendants of massacre survivors and abuse in boarding schools. Many community members comment that they feel they are always in a state of mourning and constantly attending funerals. So it's really a way of life for many of our people. I'm going to go through this part rather quickly. It's just in terms of the little bit that I wanted to share about the development of historical trauma theory and intervention research, and why it's important, because I think when you're looking at developing theories, it's kind of important to look at where it came from, the motivation. So in terms of my own experience in the late 1970s, I became conscious of carrying ancestral trauma and grief. And I've shared that sometimes that much like those people who know about Bill W. and that he had, who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, he had sort of this almost like spiritual experience when he sobered up. And I had a kind of experience like that where I was sitting looking at old photos and I started crying. I just got overwhelmed with this deep sense of grief and I was sobbing. And I had this awareness that this was really big and was bigger than myself and bigger than my own family, bigger than the community. And then I started hearing about the Jewish Holocaust and looking into that a little bit, and hearing about a book called Children of the Holocaust by Helen Epstein, who's a child of Holocaust survivors, who started talking with other survivors about their emotional experiences of growing up in a family of Holocaust survivors. And even though I never, to this day, even though I cite the book, I have never read the book to this day. In fact, my sister tried to read the book and said she couldn't get through it because it was too painful. She really identified with a lot of what was in the book. I became more aware that other communities that have experienced massive group trauma. And then I actually, being at Columbia University is kind of like going back, like doing a full circle, because I actually got my master's in social work there. So at the time that I went, it was very clinically, was a clinically oriented program and very psychoanalytic, and that also influenced me, and I was very young at the time when I went to school. So those are some of the things. And then I continued practicing as a clinician in reservation and urban communities, and also in ceremonies, praying for the help to help our people with our pain and our suffering. So then I'll go through the definition of the historical trauma and historical unresolved grief and historical trauma response in a bit. So it came from mostly reservation-based and cultural, spiritual kinds of immersion. So I didn't start out as a researcher, so I just have to be upfront about that. I started as a clinician and saw problems in our community and wanted to do something about it. And so I think a lot of this we talked about in the introduction the Takini Network, and then we've done some incorporation of the model into parenting work as well. And Takini is a Lakota word that means survivor or to come back to life, to be born again. And so we devoted ourselves to trying to address healing from historical trauma and historical unresolved grief. We sponsored a Models for Healing Indigenous Survivors of Historical Trauma conference, 3 of them from 2001 to 2004. And I'm going to show the video, the Takini Network video at the end that sort of summarizes things, and you'll see a little bit of the footage from the conference where we came together with other massively traumatized populations as well to exchange ideas about healing. And then the historical trauma intervention was recognized through a special minority initiative from the Center for Mental Health Services under SAMHSA for a Lakota Regional Community Action Grant in 2001, but we haven't gone the next step to get it on the Registry of Evidence-Based Practices or Empirically Supported Treatments. And that is one of the goals. That's one of the reasons why, the primary reason actually why I came to Columbia University, to try to get access to more of the kinds of resources that would lead to getting those fundings. Because what I was seeing in the community was that our peoples were being asked by the funders to use evidence-based practices, but they're not developed from our own communities. They're not our own grassroots approaches. And I was like beating my head against the wall to try to communicate this and do something about it. So I felt like, well, what we need to do and what I'd like to see federal agencies do is to support funding for people to study and our own practices and have that elevated to that status, but we need resources to do that instead of imposing these other models and saying, well, culturally adapt it, have a powwow, serve some fry bread, and that's cultural adaptation, So it's been kind of a concern of mine for a long time. So I'm working with a group at the affiliated with Columbia University's medical school, the Hispanic Treatment Program, a very good group of sensitive clinicians and clinical researchers who get it. They think historical trauma is important. They want to support me in that, and they're open to me working with indigenous peoples from Latin America, which goes back to my earlier point of Sitting Bull's vision of uniting our people, because there were no borders like there are now in our traditions. We are relatives across the borders, so that's part of what I'm up to. So the definition of historical trauma is cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including one's own lifespan, that comes from that massive group trauma. And that's important to note because I realize as time has gone on that the term is confusing. That what the original intent of the term was to not just focus on the past, but to make the past very prominent and put everything in the historical context. But it includes lifespan trauma because everything up to a minute ago is history. So it was never intended to not look at current lifespan trauma. And the historical trauma response is a constellation of features in reaction to massive group trauma, and then there's the grief that accompanies that trauma. Some of the things that historical trauma theory addresses, which is good, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges, is that in some of the studies and some of the things that people have observed is that Native peoples may have a higher trauma threshold, possibly due to severe and chronic trauma exposure, and may not meet the PTSD criteria. And the probability of cultural biases in the PTSD assessment instruments. This was something in a study by Spiro Manson and others at the National Center for American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Research, which is at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center. And in their study of adolescents in boarding school, they found that 2/3 of American Indian youth affirmed multiple traumas, yet did not meet the PTSD criteria. So they thought something was strange about that, so they were trying to propose why that would happen. Even given that, according to the Surgeon General's report, the PTSD incidence among American Indians and Alaska Natives is 22%, and I think, this is off the top of my head, the national incidence is about 8% of the general population. And then others have noted the need to incorporate cumulative trauma, including genocide, racism, and oppression, in addition to complex individual trauma, multiple traumas across the lifespan. There's limitations of PTSD. It neglects cultural context and collective as well as unique individual responses. And then there are cultural idioms of distress. There's ways that people experience and manifest and express distress within the culture that's often not captured by the PTSD diagnosis and doesn't address issues of violence or genocide experienced by indigenous groups. There's some of the challenges with historical trauma theory is that there's a tension between describing this distress response to massive trauma and loss across generations and developing a paradigm that does not stigmatize people. And this is something similar that the Jewish Holocaust community has dealt with in developing the survivor's child complex, which was developed by Holocaust clinicians who were also children of survivors themselves, and felt that that's why they didn't call it a syndrome, unlike the concentration camp syndrome, which was more pathologizing. They called it a complex. So using words like response, complex, features, is less stigmatizing and less pathologizing. And some of the other challenges are that there's limited empirical data. We're beginning to change that, but there's still limited empirical data about the existence of historical trauma, the historical trauma response, what is it? It's really like, I was thinking about like one of those huge jigsaw puzzles to try to figure out how to research this, because it comes more from an indigenous kind of a thinking and paradigm, which is more holistic, and in research having to break it down into these little components and everything be separated is very mind-boggling and very difficult. So I really appreciate my colleagues that you'll be hearing from today too, who are really struggling with this and trying to do something about it. What I tried to focus on was sort of making the assumption of the historical trauma response based on my own experience, and then developing an intervention and looking at intervention response. And how successful an intervention would be. So I focused in on intervention research and not so much on proving or disproving the existence of historical trauma or the historical trauma response. But that is important, very important work. And then we also don't know about the diversity across tribes in terms of how people respond to historical trauma and how different degrees of trauma exposure, that there are some differences based on tribal history and regional histories. Some of the similar suggested terms, soul wound is one suggested term to describe the wounding of spiritual injury or psyche resulting from the colonization and oppression across generations. And some people have said that soul wound is sort of the Indian way of saying historical trauma. But in reality, just among the Lakota, the soul wound is not really expressed in the language in our work. Now, it depends on, of course, who you speak to and who's translating from Lakota to English to Lakota, but the expressions were things more like carrying the trauma, lowering the heart, to describe ongoing depression, sadness, guilt, and anger. So I think it would be really good for us to research and find out in different indigenous communities how traditionally people talk about wounding, trauma, grief, carrying the trauma. One thing is we came up with a term based on our own language called Wakiksuyapi, which is memorial people, which is sort of like that you're carrying this trauma and you're carrying this grief that needs to be healed. In an effort to further clarify definitions, another term, the colonial trauma response, has been introduced by my friend and colleague Karina Walters and Tessa Evans Campbell. And you'll be hearing from Karina a little later this morning, so I'm not going to go into that. But this was a good effort to try to clarify things. The problem is that we're still struggling with that because actually the historical trauma response includes colonial trauma. But historical trauma response may just be too broad. So it's very helpful for people to be looking at breaking down the components in terms of fitting into the research. Some of this I'm going to skip. I just wanted to mention that. And you don't have all of this in your handouts because for two reasons. One is I didn't get the handouts done in time to go along with the handouts. I used handouts that I tend to use in general. And also, some of this is not yet published. It's going to be in a paper, and so I'm a little concerned with copyright stuff. So those are two of the reasons why you don't have all this information in your handouts. I think one thing to point out is that our people are suffering from depression, PTSD, and prolonged or complicated grief. But we don't have enough information about all of that. But in some of the research, for example, there's a lifetime prevalence rate of depression among American Indian women in primary care that Bonnie Duran and others examined, and that lifetime prevalence was 44%, and 86% of these women that were depressed had boarding school experience, had attended boarding schools. And then American Indians had an adult trauma exposure rate of 62.4% to 69.8% to at least one traumatic event, and a substantial portion of those entailed the death of a loved one, and that was more work from Spiro Manson's group and the SuperPIP study, which was on a very large study of southwestern and northern plains reservations, a couple of reservations. And then there's a scarcity of clinical trials that American Indians just aren't included most of the time, and also our people's underutilized mental health services, even given all of our problems and that we have in our communities, and are less likely to respond to treatment or to stay in treatment. Now, there's some things to say about prolonged grief or mourning in the community, is that in my opinion, our mourning resolution is distinct from European American grief. If you just look at our traditional cultures and the way that we mourn and the level of attachment in our extended family kinship networks, our fifth cousins are like our siblings. You can't marry your fifth cousin traditionally, and like you can in this country, you can legally marry your third cousin. But in a traditional way, you can't do that. So that both extends our support network in our family, but it also keeps us mourning more and grieving more, because your fifth cousin dies and you're going to that funeral and you're mourning that as if it's a very close relative in the dominant cultural system. Also, there's a loss of close relatives in many tribes are mourned in specific ways, and one of the things is the cutting of the hair, and so there's a sense of the loss of part of the self that when somebody close to you dies, and that you're considered as a bereaved person closer to the spirit world, at least for that year. And there's certain ceremonies that are performed. You know, there's spirit-keeping ceremonies, spirit-releasing ceremonies, and then wiping of the tears ceremonies in different kinds of formats in different tribes. But a lot of that was outlawed, actually in 1883. It was 1881, and then I think enacted in 1883, our traditional ceremonies were outlawed by the federal government. And only when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act came into being did this really start to change. And still, we cannot bury our dead the way we used to traditionally. That's not allowed. We have to follow the codes and the way things are imposed. And in urban communities, people struggle with, if they want to do the wakes that last all night for several days, to find a facility that will accommodate that kind of wake. That's a real challenge for people. And then just the massive group trauma really sets us up for impaired grief, because you don't have enough time to recover from one death before another one comes along. The literature on complicated or traumatic grief, or now the newer nomenclature or title, prolonged grief, they do have that literature has some relevance for historical unresolved grief, but most of these studies are among what they call conjugally bereaved. They tend to be, for the most part, dominant culture, middle class, people who are widowed or who become widowed. And that's what the study is about. There are very few that focus on multiple losses at one time or chronic, traumatic, violent deaths on an ongoing basis. So we don't have enough information about how people respond to that in terms of the research. So it doesn't really describe the kind of bereavement that indigenous peoples face on top of our generational kind of bereavement that we're still going through. So historical unresolved grief is an attempt to try to define and identify and address that collective cumulative trauma across generations, including the massive losses during the lifespan within a traumatic historical context. And placing it in a historical context seems to be empowering to people and make them feel like, gee, no wonder I feel this way, no wonder my family's like this, and they don't feel stigmatized. They feel like this makes sense, and they have an explanation. Historical unresolved grief also includes the yearning, pining, and preoccupation with the deceased, but also with the ancestors, not just the person who just died, but our ancestors that died generations ago that we are still grieving and mourning and preoccupied with, and we feel loyal to their suffering. And it's as if to not suffer ourselves is to not honor them or to forget them. And that we have people who report intrusive images of massacre dreams, today. And it's like in the dreams, sometimes they're being killed or fleeing the cavalry along with the ancestors who were killed. So that's one thing that that movie, what was it called, with Val Kilmer? I'm blocking the name of it. Anyway, they got, yes, Thunderheart did get right. There's some things they got right in the movie. But avoidance is talked about in prolonged grief as well as PTSD. But what we see is, which is kind of avoiding memories of the trauma. But what we also see in our community is almost the reverse. Like it's constantly focusing on it. So that's not really described in the research literature. So it's kind of this psychic escape into the past and fantasies of reunion with deceased relatives. And it's almost like engagement with reminders of the original trauma, constant memorializations, which are culturally resilient attempts to cope with the massive losses, but I think are also signs that our people are still dealing with trying to heal from this. I just want to mention, now Rachel Yehuda has newer research, but I haven't included that in here. But basically, I just want to make one point that she's looking at children of Holocaust survivors, and she's finding differences between children of Holocaust survivors and control groups, people who are matched otherwise but are not children of Holocaust survivors. And she's finding some statistically significant differences which indicate or support the concept of intergenerational transmission, and that the parental trauma symptoms are the critical risk factors for the children's trauma responses rather than the children's own lifespan trauma. So that's some interesting work going on there. I want to just briefly mention a couple of these trauma response features, just highlight a few. Survivor guilt. Psychic numbing we'll see in the video at the end with the credits, and I'll point it out, there's some boarding school slides, and you see a perfect example of psychic numbing, and that's really trying to avoid the pain, but you shut down all your feelings, basically, so you're sort of walking through life just not very alive, like kind of dead walking through life, but you're sort of dead inside. So that's something that is observed in complicated grief and also with PTSD. And is talked about in the Holocaust literature. Reenactment of ancestral suffering within one's own life. So our loyalty to the deceased, our identification with the ancestral pain, these things are all kind of interrelated. and trying to undo the pain of the ancestral past. So our people are very focused on that, and people talk about that they feel this responsibility to fix, to undo, to make up for what our ancestors and our relatives are suffering. And I think it's really important that compensatory fantasies, that means to compensate for, that's something that was observed in children of Holocaust survivors by Dr. Eva Fogelman and others, that feeling responsible then to live one's life to make up for this past trauma. And so you're not necessarily then following your own path or what you're supposed to do in life because you're stuck on fixing the trauma of other people, of our peoples. So that's part of what the idea of Wakiksuyapi is about, memorial people, that we're kind of carrying this for maybe groups of us carrying it for the whole nation. So the first historical trauma intervention in 1992 was reservation-based and took place in the Black Hills. In terms of research then, what's challenging is, well, how do you know what part of this was really effective? Was it because it was in the Black Hills, and which is a very sacred healing place for us? Was it the ceremonies? I had, before I did this, I had somebody suggest to me to have a control group and withhold the traditional ceremonies from half of the people. And I said, I can't do that. I just felt like that was unethical and sacrilegious in our way, and you just couldn't do that. So we have to find other ways to respect our traditions in terms of research. So what we did was a pre-test, post-test kind of design. So there's also waiting lists that you can do as control. So you have to be creative to try to fit into sort of the research mode, but also educate people about integrity in the research and research that involves the community. So anyway, it was a quasi-experimental study, 45 Lakota, on the effectiveness of the intervention, and incorporated traditional culture and ceremonies throughout, included psychoeducation, narratives, and trauma testimony, and lots of audiovisual materials to educate, but also to stimulate people to think about the original, really the original trauma. And in a lot of releasing of that trauma. Since I'm skipping, because some of this you'll get to see anyway in the film in essence. So it was designed to reduce stigma and pain of looking at personal trauma. So after the historical trauma, I mean the whole thing is historical trauma, but I mean the original trauma was dealt with, then people moved into their own lifespan trauma, but looked at it in that context, and it made much more sense to them. So it's almost like taking a line and looking at the original trauma and where you are in relation to that original trauma. So the mean age, the average age of the study population at the time was 43, and this was a group who many had attended boarding schools, and at an early age, you know, that the majority before 9 years old, but many before 6 or 7 years old. And the physical distance from home was 123 miles, but there were many who were 300 miles away from home. And physical abuse and sexual abuse by boarding school staff was reported by a number of the participants. And most of the parents, 90% of the parents, had attended boarding school, so you have that intergenerational trauma there. And then a lot of current grief within the last 2 years. 50% had, 100% in the past 2 years, but 50% reported the death of a close relative in the past year. So in terms of the research, it was, you know, you could say, well, these people came to this because they were in a current state of grief and mourning, and that's a valid point. So we know that more work needs to be done, and one of the limitations of doing the work has been to get the funding to do it. So that's why we haven't yet done sort of the more longitudinal study and kind of refining the intervention more, but that's what we're hoping to do. So just the highlights of the results. I didn't put any of the statistics in this because I thought it would be faster just to summarize, but that's in the articles, and you do have references, at least in terms of my articles I did put on there. reduction in the handouts, reduction in the sense of feeling responsible to undo the painful historical past, decrease in guilt, increase in joy, improved valuation of one's true self and one's tribe, and an increased sense of personal power. And then involving this with parents and doing a qualitative study of, so combining parenting skill curriculum with historical trauma immersion, historical trauma intervention. Parents felt an increased sense of being competent as parents and closer to their children and closer to their own parents and grandparents and their extended kinship network, and improved relationships, and an increased use of traditional language, which we weren't even looking at that as a hoped outcome, but we had a lot of traditional language in the curriculum. And so the people that were already fluent in the language but weren't using it so much at home and with their kids, that increased, which was great. And this was with Lakota parents, and then they felt increased pride in being Lakota, valuing one's own culture, like our traditional laws. So in spite of the small number, the levels of significance were overwhelmingly positive, and then the ongoing community response over the years and the requests for training, and we've done some of the intervention training in different communities, but we haven't had the funding to do the research, on it. We focused on the intervention, but so there's a lot of interest within the United States and Canada about this, and some beginning interest too in Latin America, or communities, indigenous peoples in the United States from Latin America as well. So at least we know that people perceive the intervention as healing and provides them relief. We don't know how long that lasts, but that's what we report. So there are self-report measures, but there are also sort of what is called projective measures that are capture more unconscious responses. I'm going to wrap this piece up real quick so that I can show you the video. You're going to hear more from Karina Walters today, so I'm not going to mention, I have something about her work on the slide, but she's going to fill you in on that. But let's see. Some other people that I want to mention are Les Whitbeck, who's done a couple of studies focusing on historical trauma, and he's empirically validated the presence of historical grief or loss, is how he's kind of phrasing it there, and he has a historical loss scale that he's developed, so that's a beginning. And in his study, more than 1/3 of respondents reported daily thoughts about collective losses. Also, a study on historical consciousness. It was actually part of the larger epidemiological study that I mentioned on the Northern Plains and Southwest reservations that Spiro Manson's group did. They included 4 questions related to historical trauma, but they were calling it historical consciousness, and they did find some support again for that it was an issue, but there was greater prevalence among individuals with ancestral involvement in a 19th century massacre, battle, or removal. So here's where you may find some tribal diversity, but lots of our tribes went through massacres, battles, and removals. So I think that we'll see, you may see some differences, but there's enough sort of meat there to move on. We have, the concept appears to resonate with many, many indigenous peoples. And I just want to make a couple of comments on practice and then research and then show you the video. I think in clinical practice, one thing that you could do is look at some of these studies that are going on and some of the scales, and maybe start using them with clients to assess things. But even in terms of just doing sort of a traditional psychosocial or psychiatric evaluation or assessment, whatever your setting is, or a drug-alcohol history, you can ask about generational boarding school history. You can ask about the traumas in their tribal groups of origin and what the kind of communal traumas are and have been, and how these are processed with the families and how involved they are. If you are in a setting where you must use the DSM-4, everyone is supposed to be doing this using the cultural formulation, but it is not being done. The cultural formulation is in the appendix of the DSM-4, and there's a good article by one of my colleagues at New York State Psychiatric Institute, Roberto Luis Fernandez, who's a Puerto Rican psychiatrist, and on the cultural formulation, so you can check that, but just expand it to include exploration of boarding school trauma, relocation, migrations, and indigenous language fluency and identity. And then in terms of research, these assessment scales are really good, it's a good start and more work needs to be done, but we have a little bit of empirical evidence now, which is great. So further refinement of those instruments and, and others, and looking at other trauma inventories and grief inventories that are out there now, because they're more than when we first did the study in '92, that might make more sense. There's the prolonged grief, complicated grief inventory, and those could be adapted for our people, but include the collective massive group trauma that's not been represented. And then I'm going to summarize it with the video tape. Now, I didn't get instructions on how to start the video, so that part I don't know. But I'll tell you what this video is about if someone can find out so we can start the tape. Oh, good. This is a tape that was made about historical trauma and the first Models for Healing conference in 2001. So it kind of sums everything up.
If one travels out here, they'll see that, and they'll witness the ever-changing sort of the mood of the environment. The land changes colors, and then you have the rolling plains and the flatlands and the mountains and the badlands.
Well, I think of the wide open spaces, the never-ending prairie, the grass blowing in the wind. I think of freedom.
It's beautiful. Even when it's cold and lonely and a lot of snow, it's beautiful.
It's a sense, kind of an innate sense of peace, serenity, and for me, a connection, a sense of belonging. And then I think of the ancestors and beauty.
It's my home, the home of my ancestors.
I think from in the recent past, we've begun to learn that we have undergone a lot of those changes, especially as people. At one time, where people were all over the area here. Over time, because of diseases and battles and things that we brought on to ourselves as a result of some of those events, we've had what is called that historical trauma.
We have shed a lot of blood. Our people have died in many ways, not only in war, but from diseases and self-inflicted death through alcohol, and the diseases that are current are diabetes and cancer, and those are trauma diseases.
People find the concept of historical trauma, which we define as cumulative and emotional, psychological wounding across generations, including one's own lifespan. And people find that concept really empowering and helpful and liberating because they feel like it's not them, it's not just their family, but when you put it in the historical context, it's generations that have been suffering, and then it starts to make sense.
Somehow it's a connection between the present and the past, and understanding, being able to not only understand but to feel and to comprehend the experience of your ancestors. And it's more, I think, of a feeling and a knowing.
We don't want to carry the trauma and not heal from it. We're, in a sense, we want to carry the positive memory, we want to carry the healing of the trauma.
And I think that's the key thing, is the strengths that they passed on, you know, from generation to generation.
So we're really into transcending the trauma, moving through it and out the other side, and restoring joy and hope and you know, empowerment to our people. And Takini is a Lakota word that means survivor, or to come back to life, to be born again.
The name Takini came up, which is has a meaning of a new birth, new wind, new generation, I guess. But it has a broad meaning for us.
But the other one is to transcend or to overcome. And that's what we believe, is that we want not only to survive, but we want to take our people beyond that, to be, you know, vibrant, kind of healthy, feeling joyous people.
And in fact, we started our work not far from here in the Black Hills, our first 4-day intensive historical trauma workshop back in '92.
Again, our dream. That's my song.
I know that there are many, many people out there with behaviors that are not normal, loneliness that is not normal, and the word Takini has a special meaning for them.
The vision for the conference grew out of our own experiences.
People came together and shared their experiences, the clinical interventions, practices, what's worked, what hasn't.
The result of how many of our people function in society is a result of, in some cases, hundreds of years of domination and oppression. That gets internalized in the nervous system and in the psyche, and where does it go? It comes out in our behavior, in many cases, towards each other.
Somehow we got to get together and support each other and change this and help each other. It's not only about, it's about people and the love of people.
We did not choose to come here. We were really stolen from our homeland. It's interesting to me that, you know, there's always this concern that, you know, that the angry black people are angry, and I think there's a lot for us to be angry about, by the way. But I think that this historical sort of free-floating rage that is evidence in things on black crime and other self-destructive behaviors are really the consequences of the historical trauma that we've talked about.
It also brought together people who are experts in the field, from around the country, from around the United States as well as abroad, Western Europe and other places in South America and Africa, and people representing the Far East, people who had undergone some sort of a traumatic event in the recent past.
The collective persecution of a people cannot be mourned in isolation. Even though each of us, children of survivors, must come to understand his or her own personal relationship to a family history fraught with persecution and losses, ultimately, resilience is experienced through communal mourning. One cannot be an activist in isolation.
Everyone at the conference donated their time. And some people found their own way of getting there, their own expenses. So that was pretty amazing that we just had some really committed individuals there.
If something happens to you and people don't protect you, if you're a child in particular, but also still as an adult, then you're left to hold the bag all by yourself. And when you're a young child and you're holding the bag all by yourself, you have no way of making sense of things. You cannot talk about it. You cannot articulate it, you cannot write a book, you cannot write a dance about it, so you're left with all these feelings and emotions and fears and things that have no way out. And it's that will turn around and really have very devastating and horrible effects on people's minds and bodies.
It made sense for me of the experiences of our people of that were not pathological. But that there's a framework, a reason why we see some of the things that we see in our communities. So I guess that it normalizes some of the problems, I guess, that happen in communities who are impacted by trauma and grief and loss.
I think the Takini Network was one of the very first networks, first people to bring out the fact that we were traumatized, and they had we had a name for it. It was trauma. Virgil had been on the ride for 4 years, and I had been working with a counselor, and we all came together at the right time.
The idea was to retrace the history and the actual trail that my ancestors were on as they came this way, and eventually many of them being slaughtered at one knee. Eventually we have to deal with it ourselves. Each of us internally have to deal with that and try to pass it on to, at least the good things, on to the children.
I think there are many ways to heal, and we try to be open about that in our work, that to respect each individual's right to follow their own path of healing. We feel, though, that our traditional ceremonies really help in that healing process. I felt like I couldn't release this deep emotion and deep pain until I was in ceremony. So for me, that was more where the transcendence comes in. The really deep healing didn't take place until it was in ceremony, and different types of ceremonies too.
I had forgotten what my grandfather had, on my dad's side, had taught me about God. He always said he's just up there, and he's around us all the time. And he has his spirits that talk to us. And I didn't understand that. The spirits that talk to us are the wind, this grass growing, the horses, the eagles, the birds. Everything around us is spiritual, but we have to learn to acknowledge those things.
I just want to acknowledge and to thank the ancestors for their strength and endurance and everything that they went through to give us life and to leave us the legacy that they did for their sacrifice and make us just the beauty that they left for us.
Joy and hope and healing. I believe that we can get there.
Grandfather, one of your children is returning. Our relatives are humbling themselves that we may exist and live a good life. Grandfather, have pity on us. Have pity on us. Ushim Gyapye. Mitake Wasim.
I'm gonna love you like nobody's loved you. Come rain or come shine.
The kids look like they're on drugs. They're traumatized. It's clearly the faces of trauma. So these are slides from Standing Rock, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud in the 1940s. So these are BIA boarding school and Catholic boarding school slides. And you can see the flags around because of the war that was going on too, but the sort of the irony about that. Some of the other slides that are coming up, you'll see one that looks like a Jewish concentration camp, but it's around a boarding school. This shows the gender differences that I didn't mention that I sometimes do. You see the boys in shop with short hair. The boys were not allowed to grow their hair long again. Everybody's hair got cut, but the girls were allowed to, and you see them dressed differently. These are European American ideas of masculinity and femininity and gender roles, not our own. So that got imposed on us, which I think is some of the origin of the domestic violence that we see in our communities and the conflicts now between our men and women that in a lot of our traditional stories didn't exist, at least before the introduction of alcohol. So, and I can't say that's true for all tribes. This is the slide I was talking about that looks like a concentration camp, but this is a boarding school near Wounded Knee. And you see the armed guard with the barbed wire fence around it because the kids were always trying to run home and the parents were trying to get to the kids. But the parents were incarcerated and their rations withheld, and they were dependent on rations because of the decimation of buffalo and not being able to leave the confines of the reservation to hunt. So they were forced to send the kids to boarding schools. And I think that was the last slide that I wanted to point out, so we'll let it run. I just wanted to end with a couple of acknowledgments here of my colleagues that you're going to be hearing from, because this is like a reunion for us. Some of us were joking about, I think it was Joe Gahn that said, or it was Karina, I can't remember now, this morning, that they came here just so we could visit. To get together. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Karina, from Joe, from Theda Newbreast. She was the first person almost the first person I saw this morning. We got to eat together a little bit, and then I saw Jim Nelson. So it's really good to see people who are working and promoting this. And then I saw Ethan Nebelkoff and Michelle. I didn't get a chance to see, I don't think. But we will, I'm sure I look forward to hearing from her as well. And I just really want to say that I appreciate their work so much too, because we all need to work on this. It's a big piece of work. It's so important for our people so that our people will heal, and we need everybody's input. And so the questions that people raise, the challenges to the theory and the work that needs to be done are really important and very, very helpful. So I'm really excited for the rest of the day, and it's great to be here with you, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. And I just need to add that one of the things that we do, and this sort of makes me more emotional, is that we've done is we've consistently had ceremonies to pray for this work, so that the people are helped and protected, you know, from Lwampis, Uwipis, Sundance. They've been Lakota ceremonies. But we also encourage, when we work with other tribes, that the other tribes involve their own practices. So we have done some training with other tribes, and then they've had their own ceremonies, or sometimes they've blended, they've wanted our healers to come, and we've done that when we've been able to. I go back to funding, unfortunately, is an issue sometimes to be able to provide this to tribes, but that would be my dream, that any tribe or tribal community that wants historical trauma healing could get it, and that it would be fully supported. So it seems like if we get the evidence-based going, that'd be one way to help to generate that. So thank you so much for your time and attention.